Hello, welcome back to some more Great Dark Beyond reveals. Up today was the Mage class, but first, some news. There is going to be a patch. I was pretty certain there was going to be a patch. These are the notes that have been teased so far. It's mainly going to be nerfs. But it's important because some very key cards in some very strong decks right now are getting hit by the nerf hammer. The only buff, by the way, I think this is the golden monkey from Marin's Quest, is going to get a buff. We don't know what it is. I'm going to assume it's a mana discount because the effect is pretty straightforward. Maybe it gives a reduction on the minions that are generated by the golden monkey. I don't know, but we can only postulate right now. But anyway, that's the only card, so to speak, that is getting buffed. In terms of nerf, Yogg is getting hit. The wand is getting hit, which is honestly when you play Marin, you're mainly getting the wand 90% of the times. Dorian is also getting hit. He had a really frustrating interaction with the wand plus some other decks. Treasure Distributor is getting a nerf as well, which I think is pretty big deal for Standard. It's going to really hit a lot of the aggro decks there. Pretty big deal for Wild as well, but I don't play too much Wild, so just first telling you that I think this is kind of a hit between both Standard and Wild. Party Fiend is also getting hit, which I think is seen play in Pain Warlock. Crescendo and Insanity Warlock also getting hit. Tsunami, I don't know what they're going to do with it this time. Maybe they're going to revert the card back to what it was before. The Razzle Dazzler is getting hit. And then finally, is he called Injured Hauler? But it's the guy from Overheal Priest. The key card in Overheal Priest that does 2 damage to the opposing side, minions on the opposing side of the board for every Overheal event that occurs. So they're all getting nerfed. I'm not going to include Wild in here, but Radiant Elemental is also getting changed. It's been confirmed, but we kind of knew that anyway. Alright, let's get back to the set as is now. Now that we know that some of the big top dogs are getting nerfed, it leaves a little bit more wiggle room for the other decks to, thrive. Now, Mage, we have seen 2 of the cards already. We've seen Ingenious Artificer and Arcwing Pilot. 2 pretty strong Draenei, and obviously we were expecting to see some more Draenei support. Why do we see a Draenei support card? It's Exarch Hataru. 5 mana, 5/5 Draenei. Battlecry, discover a spell and reduce its cost by 1. If you play it this turn, repeat this effect. Wow, this effect is completely bonkers. We have seen it kind of before. It was on Instructor Fireheart. This was a very strong legendary. I think this was back in Skullmance, right? It was there or thereabouts. It's around that set. A lot of value Shaman decks around this card, and it had basically the same effect, with the exception that you didn't get a discount on the spells. You could only generate spells that cost more than 1, though. Hataru can generate any cost spells, and it discounts them by 1, so you could hit a 1-cost spell and turn it to a 0-cost spell, in which case you're not spending mana to repeat the effect. That is really, really strong. This is an insanely strong effect. I will say the stat line is better on Fireheart, because realistically you want more mana to spend on casting random spells rather than paying them for a fairly weak stat line. But in terms of the value that Hataru gives you after you've played it, it definitely just blows Fireheart out of the water. Now, one thing I'm not actually fully aware of is how does this interact with Teithalan? You might have forgotten about Teithalan. No one has ever played this card. However, it does say that cards that didn't start in your deck cost 4 less, but not less than 1. Do you get the reduction on Teithalan before the Hataru effect completes? Because if you do, I believe that means that if you discover any spell that costs 4 or less, if you have both Hataru and Teithalan on the board, they cost 0. Because I think it will take it down to 1 by Teithalan and down to 0 by Hataru. At least that used to be an interaction. I can't remember what the card's called now, but it used to be an interaction with Sorcerer's Apprentice and something else that said don't reduce it below 1. But with Sorcerer's Apprentice, it did take it below 1. Maybe this is going to be too strong. Maybe this is something that's thought about. Maybe it doesn't work that way. I mean, if it does work that way, you're still spending 9 mana to set this combo up. But you could go fairly infinite with it, so honestly, if this works, watch this space, because I can see Hataru Teithalan combo being pretty obnoxious. It basically only breaks when you get a spell that costs more than 6. And then you're fairly sad. Also, obviously the intention of this, when I said, you don't really want to spend all this mana on this card, why don't you just not spend all your mana on this card? If you play your Ingenious Artificer, the turn before you play Exarch Hataru, it's a 5-attack minion. It will refresh its full mana costs used to spend on it. And then you can just spend all of your mana on random spells. value, so much value, value, value. And obviously the real, like, the golden combo is if you can get an Archwing Pilot on the field as well, in which case your Hataru is basically going to fully charge up your pilot, and you're just going to be pew-pewing lasers everywhere. And that's not all, ladies and gentlemen, that's not all. Because you could Astral Vigilant this card to get it back, to repeat the combo again, because this has a tribe on it, whereas Fireheart did not have a tribe on the card to stop you doing shit like this. You can also Velen this card, in which case you would get Exarch Hataru's effect on your Velen as well. Now, it does cost 7 to do this, but it's still a pretty strong effect with, 3 mana left over, casting some random spells of those costs, which are discounted by 1 as well. I see a world where this value Draenei deck works, and I'm all there for it. It feels very mid-rangey deck to play. I like playing mid-range decks, so I'm really looking forward to trying to put a package all together for this. And then obviously one final big payoff if you even just, cast a bunch of spells with Exarch Hataru, ignoring any other combos with that. You can finish people off with the Galactic Projection Orb. That card wants you to play lots and lots of spells. Exarch Hataru could cast you lots and lots of spells, so I definitely see something like this deck working, but I'm not put together a list just yet. We'll see as the full set unfolds what we might want to do, but I like the idea of the direction of this Draenei Mage deck. One final thing worth mentioning about this card as well is that it could go into Paladin Taurus deck. You might be saying how, and I've kind of spoiled it already. Some of the minions that exist in the game of Hearthstone are going to be reallocated as Draenei cards, because that's what they are on the art. Rayla is one of them, and Stargazer Luna is another one, so these cards could both go into your Draenei Mage deck. And there's a lot of synergy between Rayla and Exarch Hataru. Rayla, who wants you to cast lots of spells, and Exarch Hataru that makes you cast lots of spells. So I see a world where you'd make this Mage Paladin deck. Maybe this gives you access to stuff like Divine Brew, the Sunscreen package as well, if you want to try and use that to buff your minions on board if you're trying to play this, like, tempo-y minion-based deck. And I did say, when we saw the Archwing Pilot in the first episode of the reveals, if you can Divine Brew this Archwing Pilot, it is really fucking obnoxious to have to deal with a Divine Shield Archwing Pilot. Sure, you lose the Spell Burst on the one you're Divine Shielding, but it's going to do 3 damage at the end of turn to a random enemy, and you probably want to remove that thing from the board before it does it again. So I see a world where this Mage Paladin deck, which really hasn't worked for the entirety of PIP, maybe the Draenei Backbone is what will enable it to work. Watch this space is all I'm saying. We also have another spell, Pocket Dimension. 4 mana arcane spell. Discover a spell, repeat until you see one for the second time. By the way, this is a card that is a tribute to Pocket Train, the Hearthstone streamer come professional. And it's a real interesting card. So the way this works, as I understand it, is you will discover a spell. You will get shown 3 cards. Then the effect will repeat, but at any point, if one of those 3 choices is a repeat of something you've seen before, it breaks the combo. Which means we're going to have to do some mathematics about this, and I'll get to that in a moment. First, let's peg it to another card that exists in Hearthstone, and actually one that exists in Standard. Let's peg this to Volume Up. Volume Up sees, or has seen, some play in Standard recently. Currently, it's actually not seeing any play, I think, as far as I'm aware. But potentially, Volume Up is 4 mana, draw 3 cards. Potentially 4 cards instead. Now, one thing I'll say also about Volume Up is you're getting cards, and it's specifically spells actually, which is nice with Pocket Dimension since, it's spell v spell. These spells are spells you put in your deck, which implies they are good spells, whereas Pocket Dimension is only going to find you, like, random spells. Sure, it's discovering, but it's still not stuff that you necessarily put in your deck to begin with. So I think for Pocket Dimension to outvalue Volume Up, which is a card that's not seeing a lot of play right now, I think you need to hit 4 repeats, which would give you 5 cards from this. Alright, let me do the maths on this. So, currently in Standard, there are 53 spells in Mage, as I'm aware of. By the way, this maths might be wrong, so don't send me an angry message saying you're stupid, you got it wrong, but I believe there are 53 spells in Mage. 2 of them you can't generate with Pocket Dimension. One of them is the Galactic Projection Orb, the other one is Pocket Dimension, so that leaves 51 spells that you can discover from at a time. Now, if you play this card, you're guaranteed to go through one cycle, because the first one can't have a duplicate. You're also guaranteed to draw 2, and so this is what these percentages are. It's the number of cards you can draw, and the percentage chance of that happening. So you'll always get 2 cards with Pocket Dimension. You can't get less than that, because even if you hit the duplicate on the second cycle, which you might do actually 83% of the time in case you're wondering on the maths, you still get the card, you just break the repeat cycle, so you'll always get 2 cards. On 3 cards, you have an 83% chance of getting 3 cards. At 4, draw 57, 5, 31. And that's kind of where the breakpoint is, where I said that I think if this card was generating you 5 discoverable spells, you'd probably say it's a bit better volume up, and maybe gives you an idea that this card might see some play. I think something rolling a 31% chance to achieve that value probably won't see play, because if it did, volume up would see play. You can continue this on all the way, and by the way, you can, at the maximum, obviously hand size limitations is a thing, you can in theory get 18 card draw because there are 51 spells in Mage, which means you could get 17 unique discoverable opportunities, and then the final one would obviously give you 3 duplicates, and it would break the combo at that turn. The probability for that I worked out was 3.51 times 10 to the minus 19. Now, I will say I was really peeved off about this because I tweeted this out, and Imic pointed out to me that, and I thought at the time there was 52 spells, that Orb couldn't be generated. If it was 52 spells, the actual final one works out as 6.66 times 10 to the minus, like, 18 or something, which would have been a really appropriate spooky number. I thought it was, like, designed that way, but no, I just did the maths wrong, so I may have done it super wrong, but who knows. I think this is, like, a general speaking, though, a good ballpark percentage, even if I'm, like, wrong by a few percentages here and there. I think I'm right. Either way, I think this card isn't very good, is what I'm saying. That being said, there are some payoffs for, you know, cards that cast lots and spells. It's the Galactic Projection Orb again, ladies and gentlemen. It's back for another showing. You play your Pocket Dimension, you generate 3, 4 cards. You play the 3 and 4 cards, some of them will be discovering more spells, and you play spells and spells and spells, and eventually you play Galactic Projection Orb, and the odds are that eventually, if you cast enough spells, the Galactic Projection Orb will cast enough damaging spells to kill your opponent, so that's kind of the idea of it. I don't think this would work. I think there's far better ways to generate random spells. So yeah, I don't see this Casino Mage working with Pocket Dimension. Also, if you're a complete psychopath, by the way, this is an arcane spell, so you could Stargazing it if you really wanted to, like, try and draw 36 cards. Obviously, that's not going to happen at any step of the way, but if you wanted, like, a disgusting amount of value, potentially Stargazing Pocket Dimension is disgusting amounts of value. It's probably too much value, though, to really matter. Alright, that's all we're going to see for the Draenei package, surprisingly. The next package, which we can already see on the screen, is an elemental package, and they're actually taking the elementals in a slightly different direction this time. We have Sauron, 6 mana, 7/6 elemental. Battlecry, give all elementals in your deck fire spell damage +1. Wow, that's a really, really strong effect. It almost reminds me of Sif. It's basically Sif's return back to Mage, even though Sif had never left Mage yet. Why do I say that? Well, Sif, the dream of this was that you play spells from every single spell school. That would take this up to spell damage +8. If you fill your board with elementals, you're getting fire spell damage +7, because you can have 7 minion slots on the board. Is there a minion in Elemental Mage that fills your board? Yes. It's called Overflow Surger, so replace your Sif and change it with an Overflow Surger, and you get to pretty close to a Sif that has had the bolts, like, fully torqued up out of it. Yeah, I like this idea of this combo. It's pretty spicy, it's pretty scary. I definitely think you'll see it in games. Also, obviously, since it's fire spell damage, you need fire spells to do this, and fully enough, when we played Rainbow Mage back in the past, Flame Geyser and Molten Rune, which are still in the set, were 2 of the cards that you normally use to OTK your opponent after getting all the spell damage, and they both still exist in Standard right now. So if you can get your Overflow Surger onto the board after you've played Sauron, after you've played Elementals for 6 turns in a row, by the way, you might be getting to the point now where you're thinking I'm a little bit hesitant that this is going to happen, and you'd be right. But if you do all of those hoops and jump through them all, your Molten Rune is going to be doing 20 damage if you forge it as well. Flame Geyser is doing 9 damage. That's a lot of damage. You're, in the realms of OTKing your opponent. Also worth noting, if you don't even go for this like OTK style, I think actually this Fire Elemental deck, and we'll get to this again a bit later, I don't think it will be an OTK deck. I think it's going to be something that just chips your opponent down with tempo, minions, and cheap spells, a bit like a Face Hunter type deck. You could also hit Insidious' Eruptions with this. They count as fire spells. So Siren, every elemental you put onto the board will get fire spell damage +1, which means that any elemental on the board is buffing the Eruptions as well from Insidious, and that's going to lead to quite a lot of damage, and also is very good versus the board v board battle that you'd be having in a tempo matchup. If you drop Insidious on the board and then, you know, a few turns down the line you put an elemental or two onto the board, and then suddenly your Eruption comes out with +4 damage, it's probably going to wipe your opponent's board out with it. So it's going to be, you know, the upgrade on the Eruption and also the +2 spell damage from the minions on board. I can see that being a really scary combo wombo. You could also do some really memey stuff if you wanted to try and do it more of a combo deck again, or a miracle deck, I suppose. If you could get a bunch of cheap spells with Siren, with some elementals that come from Siren, because remember as well, Siren doesn't actually have the spell damage itself. It has to be elementals you play after playing Siren. You could try and make some sort of miracle deck work with Pyrotechnician that generates you random fire spells, and you can cast those random fire spells to give you more random fire spells. I don't think the package is quite there for Pyrotechnician miracle deck, but someone will try and do some meme stuff with it, I can imagine. One other really disgusting thing, and it's kind of going to be hard to do because almost certainly you're playing Siren in a deck full of elementals since its effect only works with other elementals. But if you can Mesajune the Siren, that's a lot of value. It's probably just GG at that point. You split the Siren, you play both Sirens, you get the effect twice. Every elemental that remains in your deck gets +2 spell damage instead. +2 is more than +1, and that is pretty frightening. It's actually double +1 as well, so it's way more than just, you know, the difference between going like from 6 to 7, going from 1 to 2, pretty big deal. So yeah, I can see Siren forming some sort of different elemental mage deck. Do we have more support for that archetype? Yeah, we do. I'm going to start calling this just the Fire Elemental package, by the way. We have Blazing Accretion, 3 mana 3/1 elemental. Destroy the top 3 cards of your deck. This is a battle cry. Any fire spells or elementals are drawn instead. So, clearly the idea is that your deck is just going to be full of elementals and fire spells. Funnily enough, the current version of... oh, I'm jumping the gun. There's 2 cards that are like the effect of Blazing Accretion. Fungal Fortunes was in Druid that used to draw you 3 cards and you would discard any minions drawn. And Book of Spectre, which was 2 mana, draw 3 cards, discard any spells drawn. Blazing Accretion is 3 cards. You don't discard them, you destroy them instead, which actually doesn't really matter for the sake of argument for this deck. However, it isn't just, you know, you lose minions, which is a pretty big deal in Druid, who've had some pretty good minions in the past. You don't lose spells in Mage, which is normally a pretty big deal because, you know, spell, mage, that's kind of their deal, right? You're going to lose anything that's not a fire spell or an elemental. Realistically, can you build a deck with just fire spells and elementals? Yes. Can you build a deck in Mage without any spells in it? You'd struggle. Can you build a Druid deck without any minions in it? You could, but it was a bit of a struggle at the time as well. So the Blazing Accretion effect is way easier to get around. In which case, this is 3 mana 3/1, draw 3 cards. Would that see play in Standard? Yes. So by logic, I think Blazing Accretion does see some play in Standard. And actually, we have another card kind of like this, and this is Magatha Bane of Music, which has seen some play in a few decks, notably most the Handbuff Paladin deck, which just doesn't run any spells in it. But a few other aggro decks have tried to put Magatha in it, even decks that run a few spells in the deck. Because 5 mana draw, 4 cards even, with 5/5 stats is really good, like very, very good. Especially if the spells you give to your opponent are spells that just aren't very good for them, but are good for you. Like, for example, I ran this in a mech warrior deck where I could give them the stuff which like duplicated mechs on the board. Who cares if my opponent has that? I guess they do care because Ziliax was in every single deck at the time, but before Ziliax was in every single deck at the time, it could have been a thing. Now, I'm getting back to what I jumped to before. Falling off, the current version of Elemental Mage actually kind of meets the requirements of Blazing Accretion. They only run elementals normally, and only run 2 spells from what I'm aware. One of them's Flame Geyser, which is a fire spell. The other one is Synthesize, which isn't a fire spell, so you would destroy your Synthesize if you played it with Blazing Accretion. However, why do you just not play Synthesize? Why would you not just play Blazing Accretion instead? Because I think Synthesize is one of the weaker cards in the Elemental Mage package, and really it's only in there to generate you some more value, because you're a tempo deck, you're playing your cards pretty quickly, faster than you're drawing them, and you just need some sort of refill. Blazing Accretion is a minion to play on the board, it continues your elemental chains, and it gives you 3 cards, which is what Synthesize does. And it's not necessarily bad elementals either that you could get from Synthesize. It's going to be stuff you put in your deck, so it's going to be good elementals instead. Clearly, though, the intention of this is to run it in Fire Elemental Mage, with Siren, with Molten Rune. Perhaps you would also run this with Blasteroid. 3 mana, 3/4 Elemental. Battle Cry, shuffle 5 random fire spells into your deck. They cost 2 less. Okay, I will say, the vision now is starting to break down. It's becoming staticky and hazy. I think this card is pretty bad, to be completely honest with you. The thing that it reminds me of most is Sky Mother Aviana, which is seeing not much play in Standard. It is a druid minion that generated 10 random legendaries that got shuffled into your deck, and they would cost 1 when you drew them. Now, random legendary minions are normally pretty expensive in terms of cost, classically, and reducing them to 1 means you get a pretty big chunk of mana cheat on the card. Blasteroid is 5 random fire spells. They get reduced by 2. However, random fire spells, some of them are pretty big, a lot of them are fairly small, so you might not always get that 2 mana cost reduction. The other downside of this card is it's really anti-synergistic with the idea of elementals, which is a bad thing for an elemental deck. You want to play an elemental every single turn, classically for Elemental Mage right now. Do you want to put potentially 3 random fire spells on the top of your deck, which might cause you to not be able to play elementals every single turn and break the chain? No, it's like super anti-synergistic with current Elemental Mage. However, maybe this is for a different package, and this is kind of where we're going to start getting towards, or at least where I think it's going to get towards. This Fire Elemental Mage deck is going to be distinct from the current version of Elemental Mage, and will eventually drop some of the cards that really require you to chain for long periods of time. Anyway, just to get down to the nitty-gritty of it as well, these are all the fire spells, not including the ones from this set, actually, but this is currently the fire spells that exist in Standard. Some of the spells here are pretty good. I kind of color-coded them to some degree. I think the green ones, generally speaking, are good. Assuming you're playing your deck as like a tempo-orientated deck, and I think elementals almost always want you to be tempo-orientated. You're playing Hearthstone, always playing curve, always be playing stuff, and just trying to keep control of the board. Then any spell that does like a bit of damage to your opponent or damage to your opponent's side of the board and costs 0 is pretty good. Like a Flame Geyser or a Heat Wave from this actually would go pretty hard. Even Hot Coals I think would be a pretty nice get. 1 mana, do 2 damage to all opponent minions. If you're in a minion-based matchup, that's a pretty good deal. And then finally I included stuff in here like Molten Rune and Fireball, just because you might want to finish off your opponent, and that's a bit of extra damage to the face. That never hurt anyone. And I also put Burn Down on here because drawing cards in your aggro-ish tempo deck, normally a pretty good sign. There's then, on the flip side of it, there are some cards which I think are really, really weak. Baking Soda Volcano is a notable, really bad one to get. You don't want stuff that hits your own board, right? That's a pretty bad deal. I've also included on this Trial by Fire and Black Rock and Roll being pretty bad gets. That's mainly because they're a bit of a tempo down, I think, for the Elemental deck. You don't really want to be spending the mana on Trial by Fire. And honestly, Black Rock and Roll is just too much of a good thing. You don't really want to do 3 mana do nothing in that deck. You want to do 3 mana play an Elemental. That's typically what you want to do. And then there's some yellow ones which sort of in between that. If you have a really weak Elemental on the board, Eat the Imp is pretty nice to give you some more card draw. If you don't, obviously it's a dead card. Furnace Fuel comes out as 1 mana draw 2 cards, which is like fine. Perfectly fine, but I think there are better things you could get. Malted Magma is a little bit weak for the cost, unless you start getting the big fire spell damage on it, in which case that might be a board clear and might be good enough, but it requires you to have a big board to begin with before you set up this combo. And then stuff like Hellfire, like situationally Hellfire could be very good. Situationally it could be very, very bad, because obviously it could clear your own board, but if you only need 5 damage and you've got 2 fire spell damage on the board, Hellfire will just help to finish off the opponent, which is kind of why I put it in the yellow category. You might not just instantly vomit it onto the board. You might, though, just use it as a final bit of damage. And then finally, some of the big spells as well. If you're playing this tempo-oriented deck, it's pretty hard to play Sunset Volley at 7 or Violence at 5. But generally speaking, the cards you're going to get to put in your deck are pretty rarely going to be bad. It would, and by bad, not many of them are true like an awful roll. I'd only say the two that are like almost egregiously bad are Baking Soda Volcano and Bellowing Flames, and that's because they're the two control cards which you don't really want in your tempo deck. At the worst, some of the other cards are more like value adds, so I think it's on paper not too bad a card, but as I said, it really hurts current version of Elemental Mage. As I insinuated, you don't want to break the combo. It makes Lamplighter way worse, and Lamplighter is the current way for Elemental Mage to beat the opponent down. It also makes Overflow Surger worse, and I said that Overflow Surger could be a nice combo piece. If you're not playing an Elemental every single turn, then Overflow Surger suddenly doesn't become as good a combo piece as it could otherwise be. Now, I will say, compared to Lamplighter, Overflow Surger may still make the cut of this deck. Because if you even just do it for like 3 turns in a row and you've broke the chain halfway through it, it's not the end of the world with Overflow Surge. You're still getting pretty good stats for the cost of the minion. So I can see Fire Elemental Mage not running Lamplighter, nor the Azurite Giant, but I could just about see Overflow Surger making the cut of that deck. Then again, I could also see not making the cut at all. Maybe they just do run this as lots of tempo minions, and they just accept the 1 fire spell damage per minion and just try and get a board full of elementals. Maybe that'll be the thing. We do have some more fire support, or fire elemental support. Spontaneous Combustion, 2 mana fire spell. Deal 4 damage to a random enemy. If you played an elemental last turn, choose the target. This card is pretty bad, and I'll explain why I think it's pretty bad. We have in the past seen a card called Scorch, which was the fire elemental card apparently of the past, which was a 4 mana spell, deal 4 damage to a minion. It costs 1 if you played an elemental last turn. Obviously, 4 mana, deal 4 damage to a minion is bad. If you played an elemental in the turn before, 1 mana to do 4 damage to to an actual targeted minion is pretty good. And Scorch, I think, did see a little bit of play in elemental mage decks in the past. Obviously, you would put a lot of elementals in your deck to make sure that Scorch could happen. Spontaneous Combustion is like Scorch, but 1 more mana on the effect. That's kind of how I see it. And Scorch was good, don't get me wrong, but I don't remember it being like the absolute bee's knees of cards in that deck. Because kind of like what I said before, and why I'm a little bit hesitant of this fire elemental package. Most elemental packages just want you to curve elementals turn after turn after turn, and it's pretty hard to weave spells into that when you're playing Hearthstone with elementals. And indeed, I think it's going to be pretty hard now, even. By the way, in terms of the first part of the effect, deal 4 damage to a random enemy, is Flame Cannon, that's a 2 mana effect. Flame Cannon didn't see any play, so it implies that if you don't get the elemental modifier on it, the criteria to activate it, it's a really weak card to play. Now, I will say that if you do get it, the effect becomes similar to something like Shadow Bolt, or even Demonic Deal, which was out in the mini set recently. Shadow Bolt was a Warlock spell that does 4 damage to a minion. It saw no play, as far as I'm aware. I don't remember it seeing any play, at least. Demonic Deal is 2 mana, Lifesteal, deal 4 damage to a minion. It does put a random demon on top of your deck that costs 5 or more. Now, you could argue that's an upside, and you could argue that is a downside, depending on the way you're building your deck and how you're looking at things. This card sees no play. It just makes me think that Spontaneous Combustion, even if you get the effect off, wouldn't see play. Like, I think if this just said 2 mana, deal 4 damage to a targeted enemy, it wouldn't see any play. And the final, like, nail in the coffin of this is Holy Smite exists in Standard. That's 1 mana, deal 3 damage to a minion. This card very, very rarely sees any play. Normally only getting some play in Highlander decks and the control side of the decks. And again, every single other one of these cards, maybe with the exception of Scorch, the most likelihood of these decks playing them were control decks. They weren't tempo decks. So why would you put Spontaneous Combustion in your tempo deck? Unless the Fire Elemental package is meant to be a combo deck, which I think wouldn't be a good idea, to be honest with you. So I just don't see this working. We also have Solar Flare, 5 mana fire spell. Deal 2 damage to all enemies, cost 1 less for each elemental you control. Now, very conveniently, we have a nice card to peg this to as well. It's Consecration. Consecration at 4 mana saw almost no play, and it got reverted to 3 mana, and it still doesn't see much play. Now, I will say, I think 3 mana is a fair price for this. And the main reason this card isn't seeing any play at all is that control paladin decks don't really exist right now. They're not very strong at all. Consecration Equality is the classic control paladin combo. Solar Flare, therefore, I'd probably say you have to play 2 elementals on the board before Solar Flare becomes really worth it. Now, I think the intention here was that you would run this as like a combo fire elemental deck. You get your Overflow Surgers with the fire spell damage +1 on them, you fill the board of your Surgers, and then your Solar Flares are 0 mana, deal 9 damage to all enemies. That is obviously extremely, extremely strong. But I just don't see this package working together. I think running this as like a tempo deck that turns into a combo deck, you're just going to get tripped up over it eventually. You're going to break the chain of the elementals, and then you're going to have a big sad time. So, like, again, you could compare this to what Rainbow Mage used to be. Siren is like the equivalent of doing the spell school casting. Surgery is basically the Sith turn, like this is the card that gives you the spell damage to let you go off. Solar Flare is meant to be the replacement for Snake Hole, which at the time was 0 mana, it's now 1 mana. And Flame Geyser is Flame Geyser, basically. So it's kind of got the remnants of this old Sith package. But that old Sith package, I think, was better placed to be more of a control slower deck than the elemental deck, where you really need to be playing elementals every single turn. It just doesn't give you a lot of wiggle room to play spells that can help you control the board state. So I just don't think this combo is going to ever go off reliably. What I think you're more likely to do is run some of these cards in a more tempo-orientated deck. You're just going to accept that Siren very infrequently is going to fill the board with a ton of fire spell damage. You're just going to be playing elemental after elemental after elemental, you know, the usual elemental mage strategy. And during the course of this game, you'll weave in every so often some fire damage and spells. I kind of see it a bit like what Face Hunter used to be, where you'd have a lot of... You try and get a lot of minions onto the board early, and then just finish them off with stuff like Skill Command. Instead of using like Skill Command, you'll instead start using the Solar Flares, the Flame Geysers, that type of spell to do them in. Obviously, this deck as well, you're going to need a lot of draw, so you're probably going to keep the Shell Spider package in it. You might put Burn Down in it as well, which is a big draw spell with a fire tag on it. And realistically, you don't care about the setting them on light effect, as you're probably going to play them on curve as quickly as is humanly possible. So, yeah, this could be a really, really aggressive deck. You also might want to put something like Ethereal Oracle into the deck as well, to give you an extra bit of spell damage. Also, Spell Burst lets you draw some more spells, so you can maybe make more use of the fire spell damage that you get. And by the way, the other reason why I don't think this is going to work is it's one legendary minion in the deck, and you can't really easily tutor for this elemental because you have to fill your deck with elementals. So you can't just run a card, and I don't know if this card exists right now that says like draw an elemental. There is, it's Mezajune. You can't just put Mezajune in the deck because you need elementals to get hit by the Siren effect. So you're kind of at the mercy of the gods, whether or not Siren is going to be in the middle of your deck, at the bottom of your deck, or at the top of your deck. So yeah, do I like this deck versus, you know, the current version of Elemental Mage? I'm not sure about it. And by the way, in this version, as I said, I just think you would drop Lamplighter and most of the other elementals that say play elementals on every single turn for an effect to happen. As you may be able to tell, I'm pretty certain the current version of Elemental Mage is actually going to be better than this one, but maybe when I put together a list, the pieces will come together and I'll be able to see the picture. I'll be able to see the grand picture of this deck. Finally, I can't remember if this is the last card that I'm doing, but there's another spell called Supernova. This is another 8 mana fire spell. Fill your hand with random fire spells. They cost 1. Okay, there's a reason I've not put this in the Elemental Mage package, and the Fire Elemental package. This is a very, very expansive spell to go into that package. It is an 8 mana spell. Assuming that it's going to be a tempo deck, you're probably never going to play Supernova. You will either have won or lost the game around this point, in my opinion. Kind of reminds me a little bit of a combination of 2 cards, Evocation and the Sunwell. Both of these cards saw a little bit of play, especially Evocation. That used to fill your hand with temporary spells, which was fine if you had your like 9 mana left over. You could use those 9 manas to cast some spells from your hand, pick the best ones for your board state at that time, and then the other ones would just poof away at the end of the turn, and that was, you know, that was fine. Sunwell filled your hands with spells, the card itself would get reduced though for every other card in your hand. Supernova, instead of reducing the base spell, reduces the cards that you get generated. And actually, it's a pretty powerful effect. If you have no cards in your hand when you play the Supernova, you're getting draw 10 cards, reduce them to 1. That's extremely powerful. So maybe you do put it in this elemental fire mage deck, and maybe you just try and vomit out every single thing you possibly can as quickly as possible, and then you just play Supernova, and that hand is what you're going to try and win the game with. It's not completely crazy, so it might get into that package. And again, we need to go through fire spells, random fire spells. Here's the list again. Generally speaking, there are good fire spells you can hit with this. There are some as well which I have marked in red, which aren't necessarily bad, but kind of bad in the context of the Supernova. Like Flame Geyser, for example. Not great to Supernova into a Flame Geyser because you don't get the mana reduction. And also, 8 mana do nothing is a pretty weak turn. For example, Rogue Rogue has a spell which is deal 7 damage, draw 7 cards. I think that's it, right? The card one, the card focus one. That card didn't really see any play. There is like this critical mass where drawing lots of cards like kind of tails off to some degree. It is a bit better when it just says fill your hand and you get a reduction on it though, I will concede that. But Flame Geyser is not ideal to get from this. There's also some other stuff. Again, you don't really want to get the Baking Soda Volcanoes, you don't really want to get the Bellowing Flames. What you might want to get though are Fireland Portals, for example, or Fireballs, or the Sunset Volley would be fantastic. So there's a pretty big overlap between this and the other fire spell generator that reduced by 2. But I will say that the bigger spells in this case are way, way, way better to get. Obviously as well, when you play the Supernova, you're probably not going to want to play Supernova on 8, because then you can't really do anything else with your mana. You're probably more likely to try and play this on 10. Will games last until turn 10? Well, actually, with the nerfs that are coming up, maybe this is going to be the death knell of the aggro decks right now. Maybe we are going to start moving into a control-orientated space, in which case, 8 mana fill your hand might be good enough to see play. By the way, the obvious other place this could see play is Big Spell Mage, because it is a big spell. And fully enough, I toyed... Okay, let's go back in a little bit in time. When Big Spell Mage was sort of first introduced with this set, before even Skylar came out, I said that Tsunami, fantastic. Some of the other spell support, the Sauropod, I forgot what it's called now, the other one that draws a spell and you get a minion of that spell's cost, fantastic. The Sunset Volley, fantastic. I always felt like, though, you needed one more big spell in that deck. And I used to put Galactic Projection Orb in that deck. People used to question me. They'd laugh at me. Currently, I think the best deck, or at least it's seeing a lot of play in High Legend right now, is XL Big Spell Mage, and now using the Galactic Projection Orb in that deck to give you another big chunk of big spells. But maybe you want to try and put Supernova in that deck as well. Maybe you put it as another big spell. Maybe take it in a different direction even. Maybe throw away the Tsunamis, especially when Tsunami's about to get nerfed, and you replace it with Supernovas instead. So yeah, you try and cheat out this big spell, you fill your hand with fire spells, and you machine gun down your opponent with the fire spells instead. And obviously in that deck, as I just said, you could put the Galactic Projection Orb in it, in which case you can do the Galactic Projection Orb in this one instead, and cast Supernovas again. You can cast the spells again from the Supernovas, or like equivalents of them. A lot of value is all I'm going to say about that. The final thing I'll say about this is maybe this goes into the Draenei deck as well to some degree. I don't think it will do. I was kind of expecting that the Draenei Mage deck would have a lot more to do with spells, which they do, to be fair, but I was thinking more like reducing spells to some degree. There is Lunar Trailblazer, but it's a pretty expensive card, but it would reduce Supernova potentially down to a 5 cost. You do have to be careful though, because it's a random spell, not a targeted spell. In which case, if you play the Supernova early and you have like a 1-cost fire spell that you don't want to play in your hand, Luna could hit the 1-cost fire spell instead, which would be pretty upsetting to have a 5-mana version of a spell that you weren't willing to play at 1 mana. Anyway, that is the Mage set fully revealed. I think tomorrow is Warrior. My overall opinions of Mage, there's some stuff in here that I think is quite exciting. There's some stuff in here that could be exciting, but I'm not really seeing the full picture yet, so we'll wait and see. Anyway, thanks for watching this. If you enjoyed it, why not leave a like, comment, subscribe. Everything helps me out. I'll see you again next time. Bye.